The constraint was causing a problem. Disabling it was supposed to be temporary. 2 years later, it was still off. There is a moment in almost every production system's life when a constraint becomes inconvenient. A bulk import needs to run and the data does not quite fit. A migration is under pressure and the foreign key check is slowing things down. A third-party feed is sending values outside the permitted range, and fixing the feed would take a sprint, but disabling the constraint would take 30 seconds. The constraint goes off, the immediate problem goes away, and the constraint stays off. Because re-enabling it would require cleaning up everything that came through while it was disabled, and that work never quite makes it to the top of the priority list. Think about a dam with a pressure relief valve. The valve exists to release excess water when the reservoir gets too full. A controlled release that prevents catastrophic failure. One season, the operators find the valve is interfering with a new water routing system they are testing. They close it temporarily while the test runs. The test finishes. The valve stays closed because reopening it would require recertifying the routing system, and that paperwork is waiting on a signature. Months later, the reservoir fills beyond its design capacity. The valve that would have provided the controlled release is closed. The failure that follows is not controlled at all. The valve was not removed, it was not broken, it was simply left off long enough for the conditions to change around it. A disabled database constraint is the same valve. The pressure it was designed to relieve does not disappear because the constraint is gone. It accumulates, quietly, invisibly, in the data until the moment it cannot be contained. In 2022, a UK financial services company was onboarding a new data provider whose transaction records used a different date format than the platform expected. The platform's check constraint required transaction dates to fall within a rolling 24-month window, a fraud prevention measure designed to catch stale or backdated records. The new provider's historical data included legitimate transactions from 36 months prior. The constraint was disabled temporarily to allow the initial data load to complete. The load completed. The constraint was not re-enabled. Over the following 8 months, the platform continued ingesting the provider's daily transaction feed. Because the constraint was off, records with date errors, genuine data quality failures, not historical records, passed without rejection. A processing error at the provider's end caused approximately 4,200 transactions to be written with dates in 1970, an artifact of a Unix timestamped conversion failure. The platform accepted them all. The fraud detection system, which relied on the date constraint as one of its input signals, did not flag them. The transactions were processed. The anomaly was discovered during a routine audit 7 months later. Remediation took 11 weeks. The constraint had been disabled for a legitimate reason. The reason had long since been resolved. The constraint was never turned back on, and the protection it provided was absent for the entire period that followed. Disabling a constraint is not inherently wrong. There are circumstances where it is the correct operational decision. A large bulk migration where constraints are verified in advance and re-enabled immediately after, for example. The problem is not the act of disabling. The problem is the pattern that follows. The constraint is disabled under pressure. The immediate crisis passes, and the constraint remains off because re-enabling it has now become a project in itself. This happens for a structural reason. Disabling a constraint is a single action. One command, one configuration change, 30 seconds. Re-enabling a constraint after data has passed through without it is a much larger undertaking. Every record that entered while the constraint was off must either be verified to comply or cleaned to comply before the constraint can be restored. The asymmetry between disabling and re-enabling means that the longer a constraint stays off, the harder it becomes to turn back on. Pressure accumulates behind the valve, and the valve stays closed. There are 3 things that address this. First, treat constraint disabling as a change that requires a re-enable date. The same process that approves the disabling should require a specific date by which the constraint will be restored. Not a plan to restore it, a date. If that date passes without re-enabling, an alert should fire. A constraint that is disabled without a scheduled re-enable is not a temporary measure. It is a permanent removal that nobody has acknowledged yet. Second, log every period a constraint is disabled and audit those logs. When a constraint is off, that window needs to be visible. Which records entered during that period? Do they comply with the rule the constraint enforces? This audit does not need to be exhaustive in the moment, but it needs to happen before the constraint is re-enabled. The goal is to ensure the database's rule is restored to a state where it reflects the actual data, not just the intended data. Third, distinguish between constraints that can be temporarily suspended and constraints that cannot. Fraud prevention rules, security boundaries, and regulatory compliance constraints are not candidates for temporary disabling, regardless of operational pressure. These constraints should require an escalated approval process and executive sign-off, not because the technical action is harder, but because the accountability for the decision needs to be proportionate to the risk of getting it wrong. The dam's pressure relief valve was closed for a reason that made sense at the time. The reason resolved, the valve stayed closed. The conditions around it changed. The reservoir filled, the season turned, and when the pressure needed to go somewhere, the mechanism that would have handled it safely was not there. The failure was not caused by the original decision to close the valve. It was caused by the assumption that closing it temporarily and closing it indefinitely were the same kind of action, with the same kind of consequence. A constraint that is off is not paused, it is absent. Every day, it stays disabled. It is absent for another day. The data accumulates. The gap between what the database contains and what the constraint would permit grows wider, and the work required to close that gap grows with it, until the moment something goes wrong that the constraint would have caught, and the cost of having turned it off becomes impossible to ignore.